The first part to this lesson is to review how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. Once you remember how to do this, then solving any equation with fractions will become much easier. So let's begin with addition of fractions. Let's say, for instance, I have 2/5 and I want to add 3 and 4/7. The first thing that you're going to want to do to add fractions is to get common denominators. The numbers here, the 5 and the 7, need to be the same in order to add them. So you have to find a number that they both divide evenly into. So 5 and 7, their first common factor is 35. So we are going to change both of these into equivalent fractions, but with the denominator of 35. So if you recall how to do that, I am going to think about what 5 times what gives me 35? 7. So in order to make it equivalent, you have to do the same thing to the numerator. 2 times 7 is 14, so that's my new numerator. The same concept over here. 7 times 5 gives me 35. So to be equivalent, I'm going to take 4 times 5, and that provides me with the 20. Now I can just add the whole numbers, and I can add the fractions. So 14 plus 20 is 34. 34. And that's going to be 34 over 35. There isn't a whole number for the first fraction, so it's basically 0 here, plus 3 gives me 3 and 34/35. So to review, to add fractions, common denominators, add your numerators, add your whole numbers if there are mixed numbers, and then simplify if needed. This one doesn't need to be simplified. Okay, now let's review subtracting of fractions. So let's say I have 3 and 1/3, and I wish to subtract 5 and 2/5. Okay. With subtraction, it's a little bit different because, as you can tell, my second number here is larger than my first. So the first thing you want to do is the keep, change, so that you know which number is negative. It'll be a little bit easier to work with. So we will keep 3 and 1/3 the same. We will change the subtraction to addition, and 5 and 2/5 becomes negative 5 and 2/5. Then you're going to follow the same procedures as you did before, noting that with subtraction, when you have one positive and one negative, it's going to make it a lot simpler for you if you change your mixed to improper fractions. If we make them into improper fractions, then you only have to add 2 numbers instead of adding the whole and the fraction. So in order to do that, it's 3 times 3 plus 1 gives you, 9 plus 1 gives you 10, so that becomes 10/3. We're going to add 5 times 5 is 25, plus 2 is 27, so negative 27/5. Now we're going to be following the same process we did before. We need to have common denominators. So the common denominators between 3 and 5 would be 15. So we're going to make these both into 15ths. And then what we want to do next is decide, okay, 3 times 5 gives you 15, so 10 times 5 is going to give me 50. 5 times 3 gave me the 15, so now we're going to look at our numerators. 27 times 3 is going to be negative 81. So now we can add these numbers. 50 plus a negative 81 is a negative 31/15. And then you can simplify or change that back. To simplify this, all you would do is change it back to a mixed number, which would be negative 2 and 1/15. Now with multiplication and division, you are going to just have to remember that all you have to do is have an improper fraction. You're going to take your numerator times your numerator, your denominator times your denominator. So when you're multiplying, whenever you have mixed numbers with division or multiplication, the first thing you want to do is change them into improper fractions. So let's say I want to take 2.5 and multiply it by 4/7. I'm going to take 2 1/2 and change it into its improper fraction first, and then with multiplication it's straight across. So 5 times 4 over 2 times 7, which would be 20 over 14, which would be back as a mixed number then is going to be 1 and 6/14. And you can simplify that further into 1 and 3/7. So multiplication and then division is going to be fairly simple as well. If you remember, if I wanted to divide 2 1/2 by 4/7, we'd change division into multiplication. So 2 1/2 is still going to become 5/2, and then keep, change, flip was the acronym we used for this. Division becomes multiplication, and then we flip the 4/7 to its reciprocal and then multiply across just as before. So this would simplify to 4 3/8. So that is just a review of how to do each of these operations. You can come back to this explanation as much as you need as we go into the equations to refresh your memories. But this is really what you need to know in order to be able to solve any equation. It's the same concept. You either need to add the fraction, multiply the fraction, divide the fraction, or subtract the fraction. Okay, so with here we have an equation that we are going to solve that has fractions. The steps are the same as they were with integers, only now we're going to either be doing the operation with fractions. So the first thing that I want you to think about is what operation would we need to use in order to solve this problem. Okay, so we are going to use subtraction because this 2/5 is being added to our variable. So if 2/5 is being added, to undo that, we are going to subtract 2/5 from each side. So now we just have to do this problem here, which is 3/4 minus 2/5 to figure out what x is going to equal. So we can just kind of do that down here. 3/4 minus 2/5. What are we going to need to do in order to subtract fractions? Okay, so we are going to need to make these both into 20ths. 4 times 5 is 20, so 3 times 5 is 15. 5 times 4 is 20, so 2 times 4 is 8. 15 minus 8 is 7/20. So x is going to equal 7/20. You would run the checks just as you did before with integers. Take what you think the answer is, plug it back in for the x, and make sure both sides come out the same. If I wanted to multiply or divide, let's say I have this equation, -1 1/4 times x equals 4/5. Well, when I have this fraction coefficient, there's two ways you can think of it. I'm going to do both ways. The first way is to think about this as, well, okay, that's multiplication. So to undo multiplication, I need to divide. So I'm going to need to divide this by -1 1/4. And if I'm going to divide on the left, I need to divide on the right by the same number. So to solve this equation, I'm going to take my 4/5 and divide it by the -1 1/4. Now go ahead and we would remember to change this to improper, keep change flip, and multiply across are the 3 steps that we're going to follow. So 4/5 divided by -5/4. Okay, so then I have 4/5 times -4/5. That is a 5, so I've got -16/25 as my final answer for x. I can put that back in to make sure that that answer makes sense. The other way that we have learned to do these types of problems is that, remember, dividing by the reciprocal when we're showing our work. I could also just change this into -5/4 x here, and then we know that to get a positive 1x, we will multiply this by the reciprocal. So we could also just skip for our work and do the reciprocal that way. So either way will be fine as far as when you get ready to show your work. That's going to then equal the same as before. Either way works, it just whichever method you feel most comfortable with.